Hi, my name is Veronica Escobar, and I am so privileged to represent El Paso, Texas' 16th Congressional District, the safe and secure U.S.-Mexico border community that has unfortunately been ground zero for the last 4 years for the Trump administration's horrific immigration policies. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to join you for the 2020 National Immigrant Integration Conference. It gives me the opportunity to thank each and every one of you for the incredible, courageous, and important work that you all do each and every day. As I mentioned, the last 4 years under the Trump administration have created some pretty horrific policies, and El Paso has been at the center of those. Whether it's been family separation, where El Paso was unfortunately the testing ground for one of the cruelest policies that anyone could have ever imagined, to the detaining of families in horrific and inhumane conditions, to force feeding immigrants in ICE facilities, to the lawless Migrant Protection Protocol program, or Remain in Mexico. We have seen blow after blow after blow to laws that were created to protect vulnerable migrants, refugees, and immigrants, and the work ahead is tremendous. Thankfully, we have a new administration that will be coming in, but the work to undo 4 years of horrors is pretty monumental. All of us need to be working as closely together as possible, supporting important reforms, uplifting vulnerable people, and backing courageous leaders. So thank you. Thank you for the work that you do in carrying out the important foundations and values that make up America and make up who we are. I so look forward to continuing with you on this journey to ensure that we protect each and every vulnerable migrant and that we uphold the laws of our nation and change those that need to be changed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rep. Escobar. What a powerful words you said to be able to ground us in our next session. Welcome to Ground Game 2020 Lessons from the Field, which really is speaking to what Rep. Escobar laid out. The 2020 elections are a powerful story of organizing and combining powerful messaging and data to turn out thousands of Black immigrant voters, new voters this cycle, and young people this cycle. We know that all of the ills of the Trump administration were currently on the mind of voters and will continue to be on the mind of voters in Georgia. The message of hate was a losing message this November, and when combined with narrative and data, helped organizers across the country successfully catalyze millions of people to the polls. Immigrant voters, many of them newly naturalized, voters of color, as I said before, shifted the electoral landscape across the country. Today, we'll be joined by panelists that include some incredible organizers from key states and political strategists to share the lessons coming out of 2020. Our panelists today include Beatriz Lopez, Director of Political Research and Communication at Immigration Hub, Sulma Arias, Director of Immigration and Power Building at Community Change Action, Leo Murrieta, Executive Director of Make the Road Nevada, Christine Newman-Ortiz, Executive Director of Voces de la Frontera Action, and Dr. Tom Wong, Director of U.S. Immigration Policy Center at University of California, San Diego. Beatrice, I'm going to start with you. I would love to hear from your perspective and the research that you did. What role did narrative play out this cycle, and how did voters respond to the messages in 2016 versus 2020?
Great. Thank you, Nicole. And hi, all. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. I've really enjoyed learning from so many people who are currently attending the conference, and I hope I can do justice to the incredible data that not just my organization, the Immigration Hub, collected over this past year, but also some of our awesome partners. As much as some of the punditry on cable news would like to ignore or dismiss our issue, immigration did play a part of the psyche of voters, including swing voters of all stripes, shapes, and color. While most of the Hub's political work was focused on the 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Colorado, we, along with some of our partners like America's Voice, Milk, and Forward, conducted several battleground polls where we consistently saw 3 trends. First, Trump's divisiveness and cruel immigration policies and rhetoric created a backlash effect that increased support for pro-immigrant solutions and pro-immigrant candidates. And I'll touch on this with a couple of examples and data points. Second, unlike 2016 and building on 2018, anti-immigrant attacks lost their political effectiveness or bite. In 2018, Trump and Republicans tried to use the caravan hysteria as a wedge. It failed miserably, as we saw. And in 2020, they retooled their strategy by combining attacks, painting Biden and Democrats as the radical left with anti-immigrant and other fear-based divisive narratives. In essence, anti-immigrant attacks weren't delivered in a silo, but rather as part of Trump's argument that he is the law and order president. And lastly, we learned that immigration can actually be a winning issue, especially as part of a series of solutions to build a better America, to heal the country, to take us from chaos to recovery. By contrasting Trump's position and rhetoric on immigration with values-based messaging and solutions, we could move critical blocks of voters. On this point, which I won't belabor, you'll surely hear plenty from the incredible folks on this panel. So today I'll briefly focus on the first two trends I mentioned to answer your question, Nicole, beginning with the notable backlash created by Trump's immigration policies and rhetoric. Three issues, in fact, really did not sit well with the majority of voters. Family separation, ending DACA, and three, wasting billions on the border wall. Consistently, we saw that these three issues as part of the electorate's reasoning and voting against him. While those three issues stood out and created a net negative for Trump on vote choice, voters actually overwhelmingly disapproved of Trump's overall approach to immigration. Just a few stats from one of our most recent polls that sampled over 7,000 voters across 7 battleground states to give you a bit of a taste of how bad Trump's numbers are on immigration. Over 52% of voters in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin agreed that immigration enforcement has become too cruel and extreme and that we should have a system that is more fair and humane. Overwhelmingly, over 60% of voters in those states agreed that there needs to be more to ensure that ICE personnel should abide by professional standards and be held accountable for inhumane treatment. And over 51% versus 39% across those states believe that there should be a pause or a moratorium on deportations. And lastly, over 60% oppose jailing families seeking asylum and family separation. These numbers are just a snapshot of how Trump's approach to immigration created a net negative for him and a net positive for pro-immigrant solutions. In fact, on the other side of things, while immigration was not top of mind for most voters given the pandemic, what we saw is that the majority of voters, not just with our base, grew increasingly supportive of citizenship for the 11 million, citizenship for dreamers and TPS holders, investing in infrastructure and technology to improve border management instead of building a wall, creating humane and fair channels for those seeking asylum, and holding ICE and CBP accountable. In essence, if Trump did anything good for our issue, it was to highlight how badly broken and abused the system is and how badly it needs to be fixed. This backlash underscores the second point I mentioned, that anti-immigrant messaging lost its edge, and not for lack of trying. There's an evolution that the media hasn't picked up today, and it's why there's this misconception that immigration didn't play a part in 2020. I mean, you had Nate Cohen, Mr. Political Numbers, say that immigration has not been the central theme of this presidency, and it was certainly not a central theme of the 2020 campaign. Well, I beg to differ. So let's briefly just go through that evolution, looking at 2016 and looking at now and 2018 as well. Just briefly, yes, in 2016, it was blatantly obvious that Trump ran on a fear-based racist narratives against immigrants and people of color. It was about the wall and fear. In 2018, he and Stephen Miller wagered that the midterms were going to be about the caravan, and Republican candidates followed suit. The Wesleyan Media Project found that on Facebook, between August 1st and September 30th, 2018, over 23% of the Republican ads on the digital platform discussed immigration. This focus mirrored the 80% of Republican TV ads on immigration in the same cycle, the bulk of which portrayed immigrants as criminals or threats to public safety and national security. Republicans in Senate, House, and gubernatorial races spent over $124 million on more than 280,000 immigration-related TV spots. That was huge in 2018, but the election results proved that Trump's messaging and this whole caravan thing backfired. Those who endorsed that kind of strategy paid the price, as Democrats picked up 40 seats to regain control of the House. Polls and research consistently showed that voters found that Republican candidate alignment with Trump on immigration was more of a reason to vote against those candidates than to vote for him. People like Pennsylvania's Lou Barletta, Colorado's Scott Wagner, Virginia's Dave Bratt, who ran on Trump's strategy, echoing his divisive and xenophobic dog whistles, lost to Democrats in a cycle where the president and Stephen Miller had made clear that the election would be about the caravan. In 2018, results made it abundantly clear that the majority of American voters rejected Trump's anti-immigrant messaging and those political stunts. Early in 2020, the Trump campaign sought to rev up their campaign machine with an aggressive focus on voters' perceived fear about crime, China, and immigration. The first half of the year saw that Trump campaign spending millions on Facebook, YouTube, and Google, where immigration was a leading message. But the strategy wasn't working, just like it wasn't working in 2018. He was losing support in the suburbs, the economy was tanking, racial tensions growing, and divisions more visceral than ever before. Immigration lost its edge as the chief device of his divide and distract strategy. So he retooled his strategy. And so this is where we see, and some of the media doesn't pick up on this, similar to Richard Nixon's 1968 suburban campaign tactic. The president and his campaign began fusing anti-immigrant narratives with the radical left. They doubled down on this as he portrayed Joe Biden and Democrats as the puppet of the radical left whose alleged lawlessness was endangering communities. Immigration, however, never disappeared from the fray of his rhetoric and ad strategy. Every stump speech and every campaign stop included, and this was tracked, included Trump's signature anti-immigrant dog whistles. In the 14 stops he made in Pennsylvania alone, the most of any state, Trump peppered his speeches with slanders on immigrants, refugees, amnesty, and a number of other wild claims against Joe Biden. I'll quote one of the things that he said in Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. Biden is pleading to give federal health care to illegal aliens, which is disseminating Medicare. As far back as April 2020, the campaign has spent over $7 million on anti-immigrant Facebook ads alone. During the DNC convention, the Trump campaign spent $10 million more on YouTube and a YouTube ad takeover featuring Trump's radical and extreme left ad that connected tax increases with undocumented immigrants. The campaign had also reserved more than $95 million in TV time in the fall, targeting battleground states like Pennsylvania with ads saturated in fear-driven narratives around the left's radical approach to immigration and refugees from terrorist countries. And then in the New York Times article, they revealed that Trump's second biggest TV ad buy from September 1st to October 15 was on immigration. It was only behind the topic of China. All this to say that Nick Cohen is wrong. Weaponizing immigration and racial divisions has always been central to Trump's presidency, and it played a part in 2020, just not in a silo, neither as an attack or as a lone solution to move voters. In fact, as you'll likely hear from the incredible panelists here, successful voter contact programs demonstrated this year that by contrasting Trump's position and rhetoric on immigration with values-based pro-immigrant messaging and solutions already supported by the majority of voters, these critical blocks of voters in battleground states could be persuaded to support Democratic candidates and inoculated against Trump's continued anti-immigrant attacks. In essence, by talking immigration as part of economic and social transformative solutions to empower people and build a better America, you could mobilize and persuade voters. I'll stop here as this is where my friends here will probably go into the juicy parts of what they did on the ground.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. I think I want to highlight just a couple data points around a losing message that also drove people to naturalize. NPNA, of course, led the New American Voters 2020 campaign with so many of you, where we really highlighted and lift up the story of newly naturalized voters that could come out in full force to stand forward with our families. And so since Trump started his presidential bid, there were nearly 5 million people across the country who naturalized. 3 million of those naturalized between the years of 2016 and 2020, and they make up almost 10% of the electorate. So through this campaign, we were able to reach 1.6 million people through the 95 articles that covered the campaign, and really a powerful message of who immigrant voters are, right? We are not a monolith. We are, in fact, a very diverse constituency, first generation folks. We have Black immigrants. We have our API immigrants, of which 67% are naturalized citizens. So I think it's an important point. And I think Sulma, my sister in the work at Fair Immigration Reform and Community Change, can speak to what immigrant voters had on their mind as they headed to the polls this November, and also the long game that was being played for many states where power was being built over decades to really counter anti-immigrant sentiment.
Thank you, Nicole. It's so great to be here with all of you and finally have time to celebrate and really begin to talk about the incredible work that our communities did on the ground this year. I have the privilege in my role now to really take a look at the broader field and the incredible work of 41 organizations that we got to, as Community Change Action, got to partner with this year. But before I go there, I want to highlight on this long-term approach that you mentioned, Nicole, because I want to use Arizona for example. That I know that there's been incredible work done by so many organizations and leaders there, but specifically because it makes such a difference in this year's election, and it's really a testament to the importance of long-term building, long-term infrastructure, and investment in states. You all might remember 2008, 2009, 2010, Community Change back then made very intentional decisions to do investments in the state of Arizona because of what was happening there at that time, right? You all may remember SB 1070. That was a place where SB 1070 started. We as Community Change, I was not with Community Change back then, but Community Change, an organization that I was connected to because of the Fair Immigration Reform movement, as part of that effort, made investments there. And we made investments there because of SB 1070, because we felt that it was important to mount a critical defensive fight on anti-immigrant legislation that, as we know, would later spread throughout the country. The investments that were made back then not only created support for the leadership that we have back then, that we have now, but it got us, to this 10 years later. So I want to, put an emphasis on the fact that for me and for many of the partners that are on this panel, it's all about long-term infrastructure, because we believe that it's critical to invest and invest early in the field. I would say that one other thing that I've been reflecting on this past few weeks, as we analyze the numbers and as we seek to learn and grow from the work that was done, is not only the importance of long-term investment, but as we look across, and as I look across the field and the work of Community Change Action and the Fair Immigration Reform Movement Action, is the importance of investing in red states, swing states, purple states, whatever you want to call them, right? Because at the end of the day, for us, is investing in people of color, investing in immigrants, investing in their leadership, investing in union and community organizing, which is how ultimately we will get to win, and the kind of win that we want. It's ultimately our source of power and our source of movement in the long term. For folks who know me, out of my 21 years of organizing, I did 15 years of that work in Kansas. So I have a strong belief for the opportunity that we have in the states like Kansas, Tennessee, the South, the middle of the country, and states like even Arkansas, who are considered red states, and the incredible leadership of women of color that are visionaries in those states and that are building for the long term. So with that being said, the program that we at Community Change invested in and as part of what we believe in investing, is the kinds of programs that build for the long term, that build the capacity of our partner organizations. And at the same time, we're looking at short-term wins and the long-term game, right? So investing early and investing in red states in the middle of the country, and as well as in key states. So the focus of the program that we ran at Community Change, we run 3 different programs, all focused on communities of color, Black, Latinx, and immigrant. And this is across, so the numbers that I mentioned and the programs that I'm mentioning are across all the issue areas, not just for immigration, for community change. So this year we run 3 different programs. We run a program called Win Justice, which was a collaboration with Planned Parenthood Federation, Color of Change, SEIU. And that program specifically targeted 4 different states that we partnered with for that program. It included states Michigan, Georgia, Ohio, Colorado, and Arizona. And we also made investments in targeted 22 districts, 22 congressional districts in 13 states. These were House races where we made very strategic investments and won 31% of those races. In total, the program that we ran for this cycle was a total of $40 million. We engaged 13 million voters, and again, the majority Black, Latinx, and immigrant voters, and broader than just our immigrant organization partners. And we worked in the total of 21 states and partnered with 41 organizations, including 2 of the organizations that will speak after me in this panel. Moving quickly to the learnings and takeaways from, those hard 12 months or maybe 18 months of work and getting ready for November and the day of election. I would have some, takeaways that we're still assessing and digesting. But as I mentioned at the beginning, for us, we've been together as a movement, the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, as a set of partners, a coalition for now 20 years. So again, for us, it's about lifting everybody's voice. The collective is about building long term. So for us, it's about investing in the long term, which to me, what that means at this moment, after what we've just been through, is that 2022 is only 24 months away, and the Senate looks good for us. So to me, if anything we've taken away from this, last 4 years, 2016, 2018, and just this last election, 2020, is that we must start early, because even things like a pandemic, which we had to encounter this year, right? And how do we prepare for that? For me, the only way to prepare is to prepare and start early. So we should be preparing for 2022 now. It's one of my biggest takeaways. I would say that the other part that I noticed, and I noticed it early on across the field and across the conversations that I was having with partners, is that in the immigrant rights movement, and as Beatriz stated at the beginning, right, we need to expand the conversation to some of the issues that were coming at the doors and through everybody, like, everybody was talking about, was also the issue of, economic agenda, race, class issues that we as the immigrant rights movement weren't talking as much about and going deep enough. So I think that there's still a lot more room for us to dig deeper and to really address those issues that were coming up around COVID-19. I think, the pandemic really opened up for us and our communities, across the country, a conversation about racial and economic inequality in this country. And we needed to go deeper there. So my hope is that in the future, and as we look at 2022, we are able to do that and do it, with more sophisticated, more consistently. I would say that in addition to that, because we haven't been as consistent and as deep with an economic and racial justice message, I think the other issue that we faced and that we will continue to face is that on the other side, the Republicans are hard at work. They can outspend us in terms of their messaging. So efforts like the Libre Initiative, for instance, that's out there promoting a very dangerous message of prosperity, right? That's dangerous in the sense that it's against our values, that when we believe that yes, there should be equality and equal democracy in this country, and it's against the very basic principle of that. And so I think that in terms of that message, we definitely have room to grow. It was huge. A noticeable gap that we have is that in terms of the digital infrastructure that needs to be built in our communities across the field, we have work to do there. So investment from the resources that are needed to do that and to do it quickly. It took us a while to get our digital infrastructure up and running when we encountered a world pandemic. So I would say that those are the things that to me were takeaways in terms of how we get better for the next time around. Overall, Nicole, I would say that our communities continue to amaze me in that even with a worldwide pandemic, we pulled a miracle, right? And we got to win. But if we're going to be, intentional, if we're going to grow, we also have still a lot of work to do, and we must start now.
Thank you so much, Zulma. And, I think it's a perfect segue for where I'm going to take us next with Leo Murrieta with Make the Road Nevada, who's calling in today. We're standing with all of our folks in Nevada who would have loved to host us, of course, and will host us in 2021, whose workers have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. And so we want to hold all of them in our hearts. And we also really want to lift up right now some of the challenges that you all had in getting out, immigrant voters, low-income voters to the polls this year. But also, I want to hear what was the thing that finally motivated people to go ahead and turn out and stand in the lines and come out despite the pandemic. What were the motivating issues for folks in Nevada that your field program was sort of able to galvanize them and move them forward?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to everybody. Although folks are not here in Nevada, I wanted to, digitally welcome you all to our wonderful state. Ourselves, Plan, and ACDC are some of the groups here on the ground who, are involved with the NIC. So we're really glad to be here. But as far as the election is concerned, saying things like 2020 was an unprecedented year are either going to be written, news story after news story and report after report about what exactly took place this election cycle. What we saw, primarily here, Nevada is typically a purple state. And this year on the national scene, Nevada wasn't seen as one of the highest priorities. But for our state, we typically are about 10 years ahead of where the rest of the community, where the rest of the country is. So what we've been seeing during this election was a lot of misinformation, specifically targeted at Latinx, Spanish language voters, to keep them kind of confused and, keep the reality of really pressing issues, out of reach, and keep them guessing as to what exactly is going on. What we saw was this administration starting off the year with a lot of misinformation pertaining to the pandemic. Folks had very little information. Folks were very confused. So whereas normally, most organizations who are participating in civic engagement are registering voters, doing fairs to get people educated on the process, we had to switch to, and I'm sure many organizations across the country had to prioritize the very basic survival needs of people in the community. In Nevada, the height of the pandemic, we had almost 30% unemployment. And so in addition to elections taking place at the same time, people were really hurting. And so it became really difficult to even try to speak to individuals about anything other than meeting their immediate needs. And so our organization had to redo, and I'm sure many other organizations across the country had to do the same. We had to really reconfigure what our scripts looked like on the phones, via text message. And of course, most folks were not able to go to the doors. this was a year where we had to rely on a technology that our communities have been using, both on and offline, and we had to find new ways to organize. I'm sure most organizations did a lot of trial and errors, and we certainly did. We tried so many different tools, widgets, gadgets, apps, and websites to try to find the most effective way to engage our members, to engage the Latinx Spanish language community here in Southern Nevada. But at the end of the day, we know that our folks like to communicate with each other. Relational organizing is something that really came in key this election, because folks were utilizing things that we already use to communicate, like WhatsApp, Facebook groups, their messengers. They were communicating with each other about what was going on. And so our efforts had to really tap into those different resources, and we had to really reconfigure what even digital engagement looks like. So whereas before you can put ads on Facebook, Instagram, and a few others, that kind of stuff, we had to really get targeted with how we did this, what platforms we utilized. This was a really interesting full court press to try to find new and innovative ways to find voters and to motivate them to vote, to hear them and listen to what was going on. And some of the key learnings that we had, and then we listened to a lot of the data that was coming into us from a lot of the national organizations who had been doing polling and surveys in our state. And what we found was that Latina women and Latina voters were, by and large, some of the voters who were largely going to go out and vote for these progressive issues, vote for the issues that uplift our families and improve our quality of life. And while we were talking to Latinas and all voters, in the Spanish language spectrum, the fear of the pandemic, what will happen to our families, what will happen to their jobs, their ability to pay the mortgage, all these things were emerging. And I'm sure that's really similar to many others, in addition to the fear of immigration during this pandemic. So we were really thankful that our messaging that targeted Latina voters and also young voters really resonated. And we saw a lot of activity and really positive momentum in our work, both on the phones, text message, as well as through digital. So, similarly to a lot of other states with very heavy Latinx votes, Latinas in our state really came through and delivered, along with the traditional heroes of elections, Black women, Indigenous women. These folks in Nevada really came through, and we're not just talking about the top of the ticket. Latinas and voters of color and immigrant voters were moving their values up and down the ticket. Even so far down as to go down to our ballot initiatives, which, I'm sure everyone across the country, our ballots were really, really long this year. And sometimes it feels there's like 30 pages, and to get all the way to the bottom is what we tried to do. And so what we saw this year was Nevada became the first state to cement marriage equality into its constitution, meaning that Nevada voters voted to remove marriage discrimination from our constitution. We became the first state to do so. This is a trend for Latinx and voters of color to move forward on progressive policies that improve the quality of life, not just for them, not just for their families, but their entire communities. Because Latinx voters, immigrant voters, Black voters, Indigenous voters, these are the individuals, also AAPI voters, especially specifically in Nevada, AAPI voters, a powerful group. In Nevada, this collective of voters has, in the past, saved our elections. We had a county commission seat decided by 10 votes this cycle. So when we say that our votes count and that our communities have strong political power, we mean that these folks have the power to win elections. These folks have the power to determine who represents them, not just in the White House, but all up and down the ticket. And so this election, although it was crazy, the digital divide threw us through a loop, the pandemic, the fear of not being able to go to the doors, this whole situation of 2020 really forced our organization to reevaluate, how can we do this? How can we go out there And towards the tail end of the election, thanks to the work of some of our awesome partners in the state and others across the country, we banded together and we put together our own policies that would allow us to go to the doors. And so we knocked on over 2,000 doors in just a matter of a couple weeks with a small team. But we made sure that we were in key areas of town where Latinx voters needed more touch, needed more contact. And we knew that it would be key and pivotal to win the state. So fast forward to our election day, and we all know across the country, it can be a very difficult situation when, as a voter and you're not necessarily confident in the language, to go and vote and to cast your own ballot. If there's any challenges, typically you're just walk away. Most folks, my parents, when they go to the ballot box or when they go to a service, if they get turned away for whatever reason or they don't understand the process, they leave. And they oftentimes get disenfranchised because they weren't aware of what their rights were. So Make the Road, this election cycle, we went to 26 different election polling sites, and we offered translations. We offered snacks and food to anyone and everyone who was in line to make sure that if Nevadans went out to participate and to try to do it safely at our polls, that we wanted to make sure that every single eligible voter had access to the ballot and to vote in their own language. We were really excited and super proud to be able to do this for our community. And we know that elections departments are strapped all across the country to provide language and language access to folks, the way that they need it. So community organizations like ours and so many other partners on the ground, work together and work really hard to make sure that voters have access to the polls, voters feel safe, and that our organizations can play a role in helping to lift up democracy, all across the country. Nevada was definitely somewhere where everyone had their eyes on us, and we were counting these ballots up until the very last minute. But Nevada is one of those states where Latinx voters decide, immigrant voters decide, Black and Indigenous voters decide at our margins. So investing in community organizations that mobilize the rising American electorate, mobilize young voters and Latinas and Black women, these are the efforts that are truly going to pay us dividends, not just in elections. Civic engagement doesn't stop and end on election day. If anything, civic engagement starts on election days. We have a legislative session in Nevada, and I'm sure many of you across the country do as well. We have redistricting on the line, our representation for the next 10 years. We have so much at stake in public policy for our communities at the local, state, and federal level that it's time now to use the momentum and to use our great victories from 2020 to move into 2021 and the rest of the decade with progressive policies that uplift immigrant communities, bring dignity and justice to workers, and offer our communities all across the country the dignity and respect to thrive in this country and contribute fully, wholly, and to just live the dream and to live a good life. So that is a lot of Nevada. I'm sure it's a similar story to many of you across the country. Trump tried to win the Latinx vote by spilling a lot of money and spilling a lot of misinformation. And Latinx voters are too sophisticated in our state to fall for it. So Latinx voters, Black voters, Indigenous voters delivered Nevada along with our AAPI siblings to make sure that we stood on the right side of history for this election. So I'm very excited to be a part of it. And thank you so much for allowing us to be part of the panel.
Thank you so much, Leo. I think, I think we want to turn it now to another state, to Wisconsin, that has significantly less Latinx and a population of immigrants, but actually when those individuals do turn out, it makes a huge difference. And so we're joined today by Christine Newman-Ortiz, the Executive Director of Voces de la Frontera Action. And I do want to let everybody know we are speaking today with organizations who have both C3 and C4 capacity and organizations. So just so that you all know that we are both C3 and C4 in the same space here. Christine, I'd love for you to answer the same question as Leo, what you were hearing on the ground, what you felt was motivating to voters this cycle. One of the stats I saw was that 74% of all eligible Latinx voters turned out this cycle, And among them, you had 30,000 newly naturalized citizens that contributed to the ground game in Wisconsin. So can you share from your perspective some of the highlights of the challenges that you were able to overcome and also the opportunities that you see moving forward?
Thank you, Nicole. And it's also my pleasure to be on this panel and to be here with all of you from Wisconsin. Greetings from Wisconsin to all of those attending the New Americans Conference. And as you said, Nicole, sometimes people think about Wisconsin and hopefully this isn't true now, but would not think about Latinos. And early on, we really had to elevate the importance of Latinos in Wisconsin to the 2020 elections because, as you said, it's a small number, but if it unites, it has a powerful punch. And that's exactly what we did here in 2020. And it was really building off decades of organizing. We are, a part of the fair immigration reform movement as well, and really had engaged in the political struggle as part of the broader immigrant rights struggle for justice. Here in Wisconsin, I would say if there's two things that people should remember from Wisconsin, we know Wisconsin was critical for 10 electoral votes for the presidential election. And Latinos and people of color delivered in Wisconsin. And I would say the two things to remember are that immigration is a winning issue, and relational organizing is critical to winning. Those are the two big things, takeaways from Wisconsin. And this was done during a pandemic, just to remind folks of why even though the Latino community is small, why it's so powerful. This election, it was decided the difference with a little bit over 20,600 votes, and that is traditionally what it is. It's always like less than 1%. And Latinos represent now the second largest voting bloc and of new and infrequent voters, and a very young population that keeps growing as well through naturalization, but a very significant number also in terms of youth. What we saw at the national level is so powerful in terms of Latinos and people of color voting at such a historic rate in deciding this election. Here in Wisconsin, as you mentioned, Nicole, that number was at a historic level. 74% of the eligible Latinx voters turned out to vote in 2016 and 2020. That number has been around 50%. So this was a historic election. 77% of those voters, Latinx voters, voted for Biden. And we know both from our own organizing experience and then from some of the polling that was done that the two critical issues were both concerns around the pandemic and a rejection of the kind of anti-immigrant and racist policies over the last 4 years that really motivated people to participate. We also saw, especially during this pandemic, where Latinos and people of color have been disproportionately affected in terms of death rates and sickness with the pandemic. Big push for us. And we started, as Sulma mentioned, we'd been at it already really since 2018. 2018 was really like a run to 2020. And in 2018 was the successful defeat of Walker and the election of a pro-immigrant Governor Evers. So 2020, it was really 18 months of organizing, taking that same approach that we used through relational organizing, basically organizing people And in 2020, because of the pandemic, there was also, and the threats of voter suppression, there's such a push for early voting. So again, we saw Latinos turn out to vote. 46,000 turned out to vote early compared to 17,000 in the 2016 presidential election. 60% of those were Latina women. And we did run, at the heart of our program, it was our relational organizing program. And that represented building out to 20,000 eligible Latino and youth voters. But we also layered in traditional work, which was phone banking, which we had to do very heavy near the end. We did COVID-19, safe neighborhood canvassing, mailings, and media. So we did a outreach of 100,000 Latino voters, of which 60% were low propensity voters, and we actually talked to a little over 56,000 of them. So this was a very escalated program, but I will say at the heart of it is this relational approach, which is so empowering. I'll give you an example. For example, in Green Bay, which is an area, everyone knows Green Bay Packers, so that's Green Bay. Comes from the meatpacking industry, right? That's where the name comes from. Real hot spot. We were very involved around essential worker rights organizing early on, really at the forefront. And from that work, we engaged those immigrant workers and their families affected by COVID-19 to then become voceros, to then organize family members and friends that they know to vote. So I'll give you an example. One example is Monica, who is a Latina woman, U.S. citizen, never voted in her life. She's 31 years old, never voted, never saw the point in voting, what politics had to do with her life. But because of her connections with people she knows and the organizing that we were doing, she then became a vocera and voted for the first time, and has now been involved in conversations about like the next step and being a member. And that's really like where we want to go with that. But that just shows you the power. And obviously children will see these numbers later when we have access to those more refined numbers. But, huge number are the children of undocumented parents that were eligible to vote for the first time. And obviously we saw the beautiful expression of that in this election. Young people who'd been in this fight for so long and finally had the opportunity to go to the ballot and vote for their parents. Apart from the federal fight was also a state fight. A key fight for us was to defend the governor's veto power. And Voces La Frontera Action was able to do that, contributing in 3 key districts where, again, the margins were between 582 votes to a little over 1,300 votes. So these are very, very tight races in one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. And just to give you an idea of how tight that gerrymandering is, in 2020, yet once again, you can see that Democrats, for example, in the state assembly won 49% of the vote, yet only have 38% of the seats in the state assembly. On the Senate side, they won 48% of the votes, yet are only represented by 36%. We are one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. And this was an important fight because, as was mentioned earlier, the maps are up. We've done our work too, along as contributing to census participation. And now comes engaging the community's fight because it's such a voter suppression. Yet we were able to, despite that, able to flip 2 seats, contribute to that inroads. But you do need a larger structural change. There's no question about it. We were also, again, as we build in the momentum, we're able to win in very local races, important wins for progressive people of color and women for the first time. I just want to highlight a few of some big wins. First, young Filipino Latinx aldermanic representative West Allis, for conservative area. First LGBTQ Latinx woman in the Common Council since the state was founded in 1846. First Puerto Rican elected to the Common Council in Racine. First Puerto Rican to Fitchburg Common Council. School funding referendums. When you want to tell someone why it's important to vote, gosh, this one just blew us away. We worked really hard, our youth arm, on a Racine Unified School District for $1 billion in school funding, which is desperately needed. That election was won by 5 votes, and we busted our butts to really work on that. And it just shows the power of that. And then as part of a much larger coalition, the school funding referendum in Milwaukee was won with $87 million, won by 78% of the voters there. And then, of course, other races. But that's just to give you the power of that that was expressed in 2020 at different levels. The relational organizing, I would say some of the challenges that we had was just the scale up. Wisconsin had not been such an important state before. So because of that long-term investment and the support and relationships that you built over time, I think we were able to scale up powerfully and use those funds effectively, and really believe in this long-term infrastructure. And what that means, I think, will depend on each organization. But just to give you an example of ours, for example, ours is the investing in a statewide political director, investing in the means to have like that kind of data, and investing in enough support to really build out these relationships as we go into these fights for inclusive pandemic relief, and to win that immigration platform that motivated voters to turn out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I want to talk a little bit more about the strategies to reach our communities and for the long term. I think so many of you shared the strategies that we have to use in the very short term to reach a large amount of people. I think that while we kind of look at 2020 in retrospect and look forward to Georgia, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the tools and the kinds of data that we need to better reach our communities. So I'm going to bring on our next guest, who's Dr. Tom Wong, Director of Immigration at Immigrant Policy Center at the University of California, San Diego, who has been studying immigrant voters for a very long time and works with many partners across the U.S. To really understand immigrant voters and newly naturalized voters within that constituency. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Tom, and share a little bit of your sort of analysis and top lines on what we need to do to continue to build forward from this moment and apply the lessons to elections that are forthcoming, and apply lessons to 2020 and 2024.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thanks for everybody who for tuning in right now. And I am honored to be sharing the virtual stage with such an amazing group. So I get to, as I often do, try to make data sexy, and hopefully I can at least make it a little bit more interesting. So when we think about organizing and subsequently mobilizing our communities, when we think about how campaigns are traditionally run, then there are some structural sort of gaps to overcome. So specifically, when we think about an increasingly diverse electorate, we need data that reflects our increasingly diverse communities. And so when we think about these traditional race categories, your Latinx or you're not Latinx and you're white, non-Latinx Black, non-Latinx AAPI, and then non-Latinx other, those 5 categories tend to define people of color in voter files. And so if you imagine a traditional campaign playbook that is trying to think about an increasingly diverse electorate, but is thinking about that electorate in terms of those 5 categories, then we are doomed if we sort of repeat the use of that traditional campaign playbook. Because as we've heard from others, our communities are not monolithic, and our communities are also not single issue communities when it comes to immigration. And so one example of this is with our AMEMSA community, so our Arab, Middle East, Muslim and South Asian brothers and sisters. When we think about the AMEMSA community, we are thinking about a very diverse community that, for most intents and purposes, are racially white, and that is the only box that they get to check. And so if you have an organization on the ground that wants to outreach to, for example, Arab Muslims, to talk about the Muslim ban, then the traditional campaign playbook doesn't have tools available for that to happen, because, again, those individuals are essentially made invisible, because those individuals are coded as either racially white, uncoded, or are quote unquote other. And so we can imagine in our own experience with the communities that we work with, whether it be Latinx voters in Miami-Dade wanting to distinguish between Cubans and Venezuelans and other Latinx folks, or if you are outreaching to Black voters and trying to talk about issues of immigration to, for example, resettled refugees, to disaggregating AAPIs, then those 5 boxes and that traditional campaign playbook, we have to just explode that and create something new. And I will submit to you all that this is our work to do. And so there are 3 things that happen this cycle that I'm going to note, and also with the caveat, there is still much to learn in terms of the efficacy, so the effectiveness and the accuracy of these tools. But I think what we are doing as a field is trending toward or in the right direction. So when it comes to something that may be of interest to most of us, it is, how do we identify who is a naturalized citizen voter? As Nicole kicked this off with, we're talking about 1 out of every 10 in the electorate today. And so when we think about a voter file, usually, with a few exceptions, we don't know whether or not somebody is foreign-born naturalized citizen and has that immigrant experience and may have immigration top of mind where other voters don't. But one can imagine, if you are on the ground and you want to deliver immigrant-specific messaging, because that is sort of the core of your organization's identity, then we want to try to have a better shot at identifying who may be a naturalized citizen voter, instead of that sort of old school approach of saying, well, let's just cut a universe of all AAPI voters and all Latinx voters and deliver immigrant-specific messaging. I think we are now 2 cycles beyond that. And so one thing that we did this cycle was create a model to identify new American voters. So this is naturalized citizen voters, as well as a more difficult subset of the electorate, which is voters who live in mixed immigration status households. So if you sort of imagine what the modeling looks like, it is complex, it is difficult, and prone to noise. But when we think about the false positives, right? So the error here, what we're doing is saying, well, let's look at places with large immigrant communities and begin sort of modeling based on where immigrant communities are. Let's throw in things like race and ethnicity and other data. And if we get it right, then we can talk about something like legal status for undocumented immigrants to the children of undocumented parents. If we get it wrong, for the most part, what we're doing is talking to AAPI voters or Latinx voters and other voters of color. And so during the cycle, we were able to identify over 22 million new American voters, and via some of the C3 infrastructure that exists, we're able to deliver this information to organizations in over 30 states that we're working to engage immigrant communities. And so, again, we still have to look at the data about how sort of accurate or how wrong. And I know a lot of us work with different companies that sell data, and you're getting a sales pitch. I'm not delivering a sales pitch. If I got it wrong, then it's my job to make sure we understand why we got it wrong. So we still have to look at those data. But the preliminary data that came in are positive, because what we're seeing from these new American voters, that when we get it right, we are getting pro-immigrant voters, not just these survey questions about increasing or decreasing immigration, but we asked a battery of items in terms of legal status, in terms of remain in Mexico, the border wall, as well as this sort of cultural threat question that comes up in academia sometimes. So what we were getting was not just pro-immigrant individuals, but what we saw in the data is that those who were quote unquote uncoded in the voter file, or quote unquote other in the voter file, those were the individuals that tended to be most pro-immigrant. So just imagine an increasingly diverse electorate using a traditional campaign playbook that says, okay, well, we have a bunch of people who are uncoded or other, but you know that a lot of those uncoded or other voters are voters of color who have an immigrant background and care about the issues that we care about. Well, that's why we need tools like this. So another tool was for those groups outreaching to MEMSA communities. So again, when we think about things like the Muslim ban, then we want to create universes of likely Muslim voters so that our partners on the ground can do more than just take those who we don't know the race and ethnicity of and talk to all of them and hope that they are potentially Muslim. And again, the caveat, sometimes we got it right, sometimes we got it wrong. But in Georgia, as one example, one of our partners on the ground had a universe of 900 likely Muslim voters to work with. And after, doing a little bit of analytics on the front end with a voter file, we're able to enlarge that universe to about 80,000. And so for those organizations that run field, a 900 person, voter universe, you can have 1 or 2 volunteers call that universe multiple times in one weekend. You can exhaust that universe very quickly. It's not only a small universe, but it doesn't reflect the realities of what the partner organization on the ground knew to be what Georgia is looking like. And so that increased universe allowed that organization to better identify and subsequently outreach to Muslim voters in Georgia. And the list goes on, because when we are creating these new tools, what we're basically asking ourselves is, can we do a better job than what currently exists when it comes to identifying the communities that we want to outreach to? Now, there is a sort of tipping point. Sometimes the task is too narrow. So I will give an example based off of the third tool that we worked on this cycle. So I'll just say for the MEMSA, the identification of MEMSA voters, that was also delivered through a funder collaborative to dozens of organizations across the country working in battleground states. So I'll talk about infrastructure and how to deliver data toward the end. But the third tool was about AAPI voters, because AAPI voters are a growing subset of the electorate, and data disaggregation for AAPIs, this has been a sort of bane in the existence of groups outreaching to AAPIs for several cycles now. And so taking billions of records from genealogy data, we're able to write a new algorithm to identify the MEMSA voters, but also AAPI voters. I'll just kind of note here that toward the end of the cycle, I was asked whether or not I could do that for Latinx voters. And my response was that this is the first time somebody asked me to do it for Latinx voters, and no, the clock is running out, probably can't do it in time to do any outreach before the election. But that is on deck as well. But for AAPI voters, what we were able to do is essentially take one of the main data vendors that a lot of us know and have used in the past and increase the number of AAPI voters by 3 million AAPI voters to better reflect, again, what groups know to be true on the ground in terms of the size of their communities. And by using these genealogy portal data, so your ancestry.coms, for example, that trace your DNA back to a country of origin, we were able to identify, or at least give ourselves a better guess about the ethnicity of the voters, so that groups working on East Asians and Chinese in particular could have universes there. For Nevada and that AAPI population, it is a, as our friends at Make the Road noted, an important voting block. That voting block is not necessarily East Asian as sort of we imagine sometimes when we hear AAPI, but Filipino. And so that is a very hard thing to do, to distinguish Filipinos from those who are Latinx. But part of writing this algorithm is to say, well, there's more data that exists than data vendors currently use to estimate race and ethnicity. For example, the Philippine census. And the Philippine census gives us the most frequent first name combinations. So our friends that make the road, Nevada, if you have a voter with the last name Reyes and the first name is John Paul, that is one of the most frequent first name combinations for Filipinos. And so we know that that John Paul Reyes is more likely to be Filipino than Latinx. A similar thing with something like a name combination of Mary Jo Guzman. That person in Las Vegas would most likely be Filipino rather than Latinx. And so from creating a model to identify naturalized citizen voters and voters of mixed immigration status households, working with then existing sort of networks to deliver the information to dozens of organizations across the country so that they can fold the data into their field programs, and then repeating that for Arab, Muslim, and Muslim South Asian communities, and then doing the same thing for AAPIs. That is part of the sort of toolkit that really has been multiple years in the making, because it wasn't just sort of, last year I started working on this and we created it. This has been multiple years in process and has relied on a lot of the experience and data of the organizations who are tuning in now or who are part of the broader immigrant rights and justice space. So one of the things that I want to end with, because I know I have gone over time, is that in terms of moving forward, like what does this tell us moving forward? At my center, I do my best, and I know that we can do better, to recruit immigrant students, students of color, first-gen immigrant students, so that we can build a pipeline when it comes to data science. And again, how do I make data sexy? Well, we know that there's a traditional consultant class that uses this traditional campaign playbook that I talked about that is mostly pale, male, and stale. And when I think about this pipeline of data scientists, people of color, people with immigrant backgrounds, people perhaps with undocumented parents who care deeply about the issues that we care about, because they live the issues that we are fighting for, then what I am imagining is a cohort, a next generation of folks who can build these tools so that these tools can come from our community, so that at the end of the day, we can have more ownership over our own data. And the reason why I think that's important, and some of you have heard me say this before, is that to the extent that we own our own data, and we can do that by creating the tools that we use during campaigns, but to the extent that we own our own data, we control our own narrative, so that folks like Nate Cohn don't write in the New York Times that, you know what, immigration really wasn't an issue, as was said earlier. And this is our job to do, because that pale, male, and stale consultant class, we can't trust that they are going to invest the time, the resources, the energy, and the blood, sweat, and tears that we would otherwise pour into this work. And this is our work to do, because I don't think anybody here has to be reminded that us, immigrants, we get the job done. And so again, if we control our data, then we can control our narrative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. What a powerful message on we have the solutions that we're looking for. Our communities always have the best solutions, right? We don't need to look far. And we also need to build that pipeline. So thank you for leaving us with that message. Before I wrap us up, I want to sort of, name that we are not fully wrapped up with the 2020 election. We've got Georgia on the docket. And I think one of the most important goals of this session is to really apply the learnings coming out of this moment. And so I'd love to kick it back to each of our panelists in the order we started with. Starting with Beatrice, what lessons can we apply from messaging to Georgia this year to be able to really make sure that people maximize all of the learning?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that, if you noticed, a lot of us said was not to talk about immigration in a silo. Alone, obviously, you talking pro-immigration and values-based messaging, it works. But talking about it as part of transformative solutions to make our communities much more empowered, better, fix systemic problems that we have as part of a solution to greater vision, I think is a messaging takeaway that I think we have to sort of almost practice and do better. And I think 2020 forced us to do that, to be able to talk much more holistically, greater, not just talk about immigration alone, but really talk about it in more as part of what we need to improve our quality of life, et cetera. And I would just add as well, aside from that message is also being able to do it in saturation. One of the things that I think everybody mentioned was that we are up against a real a really incredible battle on digital. And I think it's an understatement to say that misinformation did us a lot of damage. It is incredibly, it's an issue that we're going to have to deal with throughout the years, as because there's so much more investment coming from the right and from other entities out there and other unpaid entities out there who are creating, white supremacist groups, misinformation, and really trying to create divisions amongst us in online. One of the things that we have to learn is to be more like a SWAT team and quick and really and make it part of our long-term investment, to not just to complement the work that's going to be going on, that always goes on the ground, from relational organizing to deep canvassing, et cetera, is how we digitally saturate as well. Not just go in there with one ad, one message, et cetera, but really be able to hit our targets with more. And because we know what the message works, and we know that we can't talk about immigration in a silo. So let's hit them at all sort of surround sound, from the ground to digital and saturation, because right now we're way behind the opposition. So I think that's one of the things that I think as folks who are looking to Georgia, if we're able to do that in short amount and keep doing that in saturation and not talk about immigration just in a silo and values-based messaging, I think we could do a lot of good.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. We will certainly be talking about the newly naturalized voters in Georgia with partners on the ground. Sulma, what is it that you would like to leave people with as we all set our eyes toward Georgia?
Yeah, I'm going to be quick, but look, if nothing else, trust the people on the ground. Trust the ones that have been organizing on the ground for long term. In my role right now, there's tons of people wanting to go to Georgia. Let's go, let's do this. Trust the people, the leadership that's on the ground, leadership of women of color, Black and Latinx women. Also, I think Christine touched on this, but relational organizing is important. Using those relationships. That's why it's important to allow the people on the ground to do their thing. If we need to send resources, send the resources, but allow them to do their work. And, do not underestimate the number of Latinos in the state or Latinx voters, because like Christine said, in Wisconsin and in many other states, the election could be so close that is going to be that is going to be the key. Also, immigrant voters, AAPI voters, let's make sure that we are touching and investing in them, because they are the ones who are going to make the difference.
Thank you, Sulma. Leo, lessons learned?
The investment in digital, but I want to go a little further. We need culturally competent Spanish language appropriate digital content that not only explains to voters what their rights are, what they can expect at the ballot box, breaking down the process. Yes, absolutely. But they need content. They need that values messaging mixed in with a variety of other topics as well. Like, Latinx voters are not a monolith. You can't possibly say that enough this year, and I don't think that we probably should say it anymore. We need to talk to voters of color, Latinx voters, Black voters, AAPI voters, Indigenous voters in Georgia, in their languages, in their culturally competent ways. If folks are listening right now, my biggest advice is to invest heavily in Spanish language TV, radio, print, and digital. do as much earned media and Spanish language press that you possibly can. People pay attention, people listen, they are watching these programs, they are listening to AM radio, they are listening to FM radio, they are looking on Facebook, they are digesting information constantly. And so we need to make sure that we invest in as many platforms as possible in Spanish, in their language as we can. Also, we need to make sure that we're investing in organizations that mobilize these folks on the ground. There's no reason why after an election cycle like this, or really any other in important states, that organizations have to do what happens normally, lay off staff, shrink down to a smaller size. We need to invest in these organizations to build power year-round. Yes, Georgia's coming up. We all need to participate. But after Georgia comes the process of governing. And for that, we need a strong grassroots and we need investments.
Amen. Thank you for governing. Christine, lessons learned from that you would like to offer from Wisconsin to our brothers and sisters in Georgia?
I think one of the wonderful experiences in this election was seeing the national map unfold and knowing the decades of organizing that have been going on there. And with so many grassroots organization at the front lines on these fights around, racial justice, immigration rights. And so I know we're folding in to help with like phone banking and texting, and sent a small delegation there. So I echo out what's been said. I think more thinking forward now, in terms of what we're facing. I just think it's critical. I know as a large network and as firm, we recognize the importance of claiming our space, as we've discussed here. It's where our space is always, even our good work is not recognized always unless we, really claim it. And so claiming our space and really getting ready to shift to figure out what are the structures that we need to make sure that we are continuing to engage those organizers, those grassroots organizers, and those voters into the next stage of pandemic relief, inclusion in pandemic relief, as well as the immigration platform. And I think like the recent decision on DACA and knowing we have an administration coming in that supports it has been really encouraging. But I always, I also find inspiration thinking of the tremendous gains made, in the late 60s under Nixon, huge gains made. So all the changes that have been made always come from the people. It's always bottom up. And we have to keep people with us as we put demands now on the new Congress and the administration, and make sure that we're building for 2022, where we can continue to be not just a flash in the pan, but a standing progressive voting bloc that unites people of color with progressive white voters that will shape this country that impacts so much of the world.
Thank you, Christine. Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think, Georgia, certainly some of the data we see about the newly naturalized in Georgia and the role that they will play, and especially AAPI voters and Black immigrants from the Caribbean and the Black diaspora will play an important role in Georgia as well. What final thoughts do you have as we wrap us up here on lessons learned for our colleagues in Georgia?
Yeah, I'll just echo trust and invest in organizers who have been on the ground working in Georgia for years, if not decades. Those investments tend to be less transactional around elections and more about base building and power building for the longer term. Georgia is one of those states in terms of data that is giving us a fuller picture in terms of turnout. And so an increase in Black turnout, increase in Latinx turnout, over 90% increase in AAPI turnout is what we saw in November. But I will leave with this thought here. When it comes to our increasingly diverse electorate, as I spoke about earlier, I will predict that after the Georgia runoffs and after the dust settles in terms of the post-election data analysis, we will most likely see the increase in turnout that was most significant are those racially uncoded or quote unquote others, because those individuals, again, are the new American voters. Those individuals are our communities. And yeah, we'll have to wait for a little bit to see whether or not that prediction pans out. But if it does, then that means Georgia and the U.S. Senate may present a lot of opportunities for all of us in the first 2 years of the Biden administration.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. Well, thank you all for joining us for our panel today. I think we had a really great conversation around the importance of messaging and data and organizing and building for the long term. I'm going to leave us off by introducing our sister in the work and our sister in the movement, Petra Falcon from Promise, Arizona, who has been a movement leader for many, many years. And, you know, one of the things that Sulma and I were talking about very early on when we saw the results coming in for Arizona was that out of the ugliness of, SB 1070, the birthplace of all of these anti-immigrant right copycat bills across the country, that there's a moment of beauty for organizing where new groups had come to the fold and people just really jumped in together to build powerful coalitions. So we lift up, of course, in this session, our colleagues and the organizers all across Arizona that did some incredible work, not just in this cycle, but over the last 10 years. And so we'll leave you with Promise Arizona, but certainly want to hold Mi Gente and the One Arizona Coalition and all of the groups that were involved in shaping a new electorate in Arizona. And we're excited to see what you build forward from here. Thank you for joining us today. And this concludes our session.
Good morning.
Good morning. Petra Falcon,
Executive Director of Promise Arizona, saying hello from Arizona. Welcome to the 2020 NIC, and I hope you will have a great time this year. In 2017, we here in Phoenix, Promise Arizona, we hosted the 2017 NIC, and we were able to be all together in person. As we know, that can't happen this year, but we are together through our laptops, through our home offices, through our business offices, through our phones and through our computers. But we are together, and we're together to celebrate this moment that moves forward for all of us as a time of hope and dignity and respect for the work that we've done thus far. 10 years ago in Arizona, our state was facing the most hateful and divisive legislation, Senate Bill SB 1070, that would put into place a law that would target immigrants, people of color, refugees, in our streets, in our homes, in our parks, and would turn people into the streets in fear and protest. But worst thing was that people were being separated through deportation. But today we now are rejoicing in the outcome because we've been able to unite ourselves with local and national allies to grow organizations such as Promise Arizona, coalitions such as One Arizona, Jews for Justice, Uncaged and Reunite families to stop SB 1070 and the courts, recall then Senate President Russell Pierce, the author of SB 1070, removed Sheriff Joe Arpaio, was responsible for the deportations of many, many, many people and replaced with our own current Sheriff Paul Penzone. The young organizers and activists of 10 years ago are now state senators, they're state representatives, they're elected officials at all levels of government. And the list is too long to mention all in this brief video. But thanks to our sisters and comadres in Pima County, Las Adelitas, Regina Moromero is the first Latina mayor in the city of Tucson and across the state of Arizona. Arizona no longer is a state where fear reigns, but that the state are all calling the new, and everyone is calling the state blue, but I call it a state of justice. I call it the new justice state that is led by two new U.S. Senators, Kirsten Sinema and Mark Kelly. In 2020, we can claim a growing new electorate that will continue to grow. In fact, in the last 4 years, 46,000 residents became citizens and voted in this year's election. The vision for the future is continuing to grow the new electorate and the hope of families reuniting and economic prosperity for all. Let's keep building our movement. Enjoy the week.